June 6, 1944. The Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps. 300 miles from the French coast, the Führer slept. He had stayed awake until 3 in the morning, as was his habit, talking with his staff about architecture and music and his plans for rebuilding Berlin after the war. Now, at dawn, as the largest amphibious invasion in human history crashed onto the beaches of Normandy, Adolf Hitler remained in bed. His staff knew better than to wake him. They had learned, through bitter experience, that disturbing his sleep triggered volcanic rages that could last for hours. So they waited. And while they waited, the world changed. The first reports arrived at Wehrmacht headquarters in the pre-dawn darkness. Paratroopers, thousands of them dropping from the sky over Normandy. Then the naval bombardment began. Battleships and cruisers hammering the Atlantic wall with shells so large they shook the earth. Then, as the sun rose over the English Channel, the boats appeared, an armada so vast it seemed to cover the sea from horizon to horizon. The duty officers stared at the reports flooding in. This was it, the invasion. The moment Germany had been preparing for, dreading, expecting for 2 years. And the Führer slept. Colonel General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff, faced an impossible choice. Wake Hitler and face his fury for disturbing his rest. Or wait and face his fury for not informing him immediately of the war's most critical moment. Jodl waited. He told himself that the situation was still unclear, that they needed more information, that the Führer needed his rest. But really, Jodl was afraid. At 10 in the morning, Hitler finally woke. He ate his breakfast, he read the reports, and when told that the Allies had landed in Normandy with a force of over 156,000 men, that they were even now pushing inland from 5 separate beaches, that the Atlantic Wall had been breached in a dozen places, Hitler's response was almost casual. "So, we're off." That was it. No rage, no panic. Just a simple acknowledgement, as if someone had told him his car was ready. His staff exchanged glances, unsure whether to be relieved or terrified by his calm. Because Hitler wasn't worried. He was, in fact, almost pleased. For months, he had been expecting the invasion. He knew it was coming. He had spent countless hours studying maps, positioning divisions, fortifying beaches. He had poured concrete and steel into the Atlantic Wall until it stretched from Norway to Spain. He had stationed 50 divisions in France and the Low Countries. He had prepared. But more than that, he had a theory. Hitler was convinced, absolutely certain, that the Normandy landings were a diversion. The real invasion, he believed, would come at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, barely 20 miles of water between England and France. That was where he expected the main blow. Normandy was just a feint designed to draw his forces away from the real target. This belief wasn't entirely irrational. Allied intelligence had spent months creating an elaborate deception, Operation Fortitude, complete with fake armies, dummy tanks, and false radio traffic, all suggesting a massive force preparing to strike at Calais. Hitler had fallen for it completely. So when the reports from Normandy kept coming, when the scale of the assault became undeniable, Hitler remained unmoved. "This is not the real invasion," he told his staff. The main attack would come at Calais. He was sure of it. They needed to keep their forces in position, ready for the real threat. This conviction had a catastrophic consequence. Germany's best chance to throw the Allies back into the sea lay in its panzer divisions, the armored units that could race to the beaches and smash the invasion before it could establish a foothold. But Hitler had placed these divisions under his personal control. They could not move without his direct authorization, and Hitler refused to release them. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, Germany's most celebrated commander, had begged for weeks to be given control of the panzers. He wanted them close to the coast, ready to counterattack within hours of any landing. He had fought the British in North Africa. He knew how devastating Allied air power could be. He knew that any movement in daylight would be spotted and destroyed from the air. The panzers needed to be in position before the invasion, or they would never get there at all. But Hitler had refused. He wanted the panzers held back, under his control, ready to strike at Calais when the real invasion came. Rommel had argued, he had pleaded, he had warned that this decision could lose them the war. Hitler would not budge. And on June 6, 1944, Rommel wasn't even in France. He had gone to Germany, to his home in Herrlingen, to celebrate his wife's birthday. He had looked at the weather forecast. A storm was brewing over the Channel. The seas were rough, the skies cloudy. No invasion could come in such conditions. He had decided to take a brief leave, to see his wife, and then to drive to the Berghof to make one more attempt to convince Hitler to release the panzers. The storm was real. The seas were rough, but Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower had made a gamble. His meteorologists had spotted a brief window, a gap in the weather that would last just long enough to launch the invasion. It was a desperate gamble, but Eisenhower took it. The Germans, certain that no invasion could come in such weather, had relaxed their guard. When Rommel received the phone call telling him that the Allies had landed, he was 250 miles from the coast. He raced back, his car speeding through the French countryside, but he knew he was too late. The critical first hours, when a swift counterattack might have driven the Allies back into the sea, were already lost. And still, Hitler would not release the panzers. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend sat north of Köln, engines idling, crews ready. They were young, fanatical, well-trained. They could have reached the beaches in hours, but they couldn't move without authorization from the Führer. And the Führer was waiting for the real invasion at Calais. The Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's most powerful armored units, sat south of Caen. Same situation, ready to move, waiting for orders that didn't come. Only the 21st Panzer Division, already close to the coast and under local command, managed to launch a counterattack on D-Day itself. They reached the beaches. They even pushed through to the coast in one sector, splitting the British and Canadian landing zones. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that they might roll up the invasion from the flank. But they were alone. One division against an army, and as the day wore on, as more Allied troops poured ashore, as naval guns smashed every German position within range of the coast, the 21st Panzer was forced to pull back. By the time Hitler finally authorized the other panzer divisions to move, it was afternoon. The Allies had been ashore for 8 hours. They had established beachheads. They had brought in tanks, artillery, supplies, and most critically, they owned the sky. When the panzers finally began to move toward the coast, Allied fighter-bombers fell on them like hawks. The roads to Normandy became killing grounds. Every vehicle that moved in daylight was spotted, attacked, destroyed. The mighty panzer divisions, Germany's best hope, were torn apart before they could even reach the battlefield. Panzer Lehr, moving toward the front, lost 5 tanks and 84 half-tracks in a single day to air attacks. The division's commander reported that he could not move in daylight at all. The Allies had achieved total air supremacy. The Luftwaffe, the once mighty German air force that had terrorized Europe in the early years of the war, was almost entirely absent from the skies over Normandy. And still, Hitler insisted this was not the real invasion. In his headquarters, surrounded by maps and reports, Hitler issued orders. The Allies must be thrown back into the sea. Every soldier must fight where he stood. No retreat, no surrender. The Atlantic Wall must hold. But the Atlantic Wall was already broken. The supposedly impregnable fortifications that Hitler had boasted would make the coast of Europe an iron barrier had been breached in a single morning. Some bunkers had fought hard. Some German units had inflicted terrible casualties on the attackers. The Americans landing on Omaha Beach had faced murderous fire, and for hours, as it seemed, they might be pushed back into the sea. But they held. They clawed their way up the bluffs. They took the bunkers. And by nightfall on June 6, 1944, 156,000 Allied soldiers were ashore in France. They had suffered roughly 10,000 casualties, far fewer than the planners had feared. And they were digging in, preparing for the German counterattack. The counterattack that should have come at dawn never materialized. Because Hitler had waited, because he was certain this was a diversion, because he refused to believe that the war's decisive moment could happen without his permission, without fitting into his strategic vision. In the days that followed, as the Allies poured men and material into Normandy, as they expanded their beachheads and pushed inland, Hitler's delusion persisted. He continued to insist that the main attack would come at Calais. He kept divisions stationed there, waiting for an invasion that would never come, while the real battle raged in Normandy. His generals tried to tell him the truth. Rommel reported that the situation in Normandy was catastrophic, that they were facing the full weight of Allied power, that they needed every available division if they were to have any hope of containing the invasion. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, echoed Rommel's assessment. This was the real invasion. They needed to respond with everything they had. Hitler dismissed their concerns. He accused them of defeatism. He insisted he knew better. After all, he had been right before. He had rebuilt Germany from the ashes of defeat. He had conquered France. He had come within sight of Moscow. His intuition, his strategic genius, had brought Germany to the heights of power. Why should he listen to generals who had been wrong so many times before? But his intuition was failing him now. Or perhaps it had always been flawed, and he had simply been lucky in the early years, facing enemies who were unprepared, divided, or weak. Now he faced the combined might of America, Britain, and the Soviet Union, and his luck had run out. June 6, 1944 was the day the war turned against Hitler, not because it was the day Germany lost, but because it was the day Germany's defeat became inevitable. Before D-Day, Hitler could still imagine victory. He could point to the Atlantic Wall and say the West was secure. He could focus his forces on the Eastern Front, hoping to bleed the Soviets white before they reached Germany's borders. He could dream of wonder weapons, jet fighters, and ballistic missiles that would turn the tide. After D-Day, those dreams became impossible to sustain. Germany was now fighting a three-front war. In the east, the Soviet Union was preparing Operation Bagration, a massive offensive that would destroy Army Group Center and drive deep into Poland. In the south, the Allies were pushing up through Italy. And now, in the west, they had breached the Atlantic Wall and established a foothold in France. Germany didn't have the resources to fight on three fronts. It didn't have the fuel for its tanks, the pilots for its planes, the soldiers for its armies. It had been bleeding white on the Eastern Front for 2 years, suffering. Casualties in the millions. Now it would have to defend France as well against an enemy with unlimited resources, total air superiority, and the momentum of victory. And Hitler's response to this crisis was to issue impossible orders. Hold every position, fight for every inch. No retreat. He fired generals who suggested tactical withdrawals. He screamed at commanders who reported that their positions were untenable. He demanded that his soldiers perform miracles, that they defeat enemies who outnumbered and outgunned them through sheer will and fanaticism. Some did. German soldiers in Normandy fought with desperate courage, holding positions far longer than seemed possible, launching counterattacks against overwhelming odds. But courage couldn't stop the tide. The Allies kept coming. They had more men, more tanks, more planes, more of everything, and they were learning, adapting, improving their tactics with each battle. Hitler, isolated in his mountain retreat, surrounded by yes-men and sycophants, lost touch with reality. He moved phantom divisions on his maps, units that existed only on paper, that had been destroyed months before but never removed from the order of battle. He planned counter-offensives with forces that didn't exist. He raged at generals for failing to achieve objectives that were impossible. In the weeks after D-Day, his statements became increasingly divorced from reality. He spoke of throwing the Allies back into the sea, even as they captured Cherbourg and broke out of the bocage. He spoke of victory, even as his armies disintegrated. He spoke of wonder weapons that would change everything, even as Allied bombers turned German cities into rubble. On July 20th, 1944, 6 weeks after D-Day, a group of German officers attempted to assassinate Hitler. They planted a bomb in his headquarters in East Prussia. The bomb exploded, killing 4 people and wounding many others. Hitler survived, protected by the heavy oak table he had been leaning over when the bomb went off. His response to the assassination attempt was telling. He saw it as proof that he was right, that he was destined to lead Germany to victory, that Providence had saved him for a reason. He never considered that the attempt was a sign of how many Germans, even within his own military, had concluded that he was leading the nation to destruction. In the aftermath of the plot, Hitler's paranoia deepened. He purged the army of anyone suspected of disloyalty. He executed thousands, including some of Germany's most capable officers. He placed the SS in charge of more and more military operations, trusting fanaticism over competence, and he continued to issue orders that bore no relation to the reality his soldiers faced. But June 6, 1944, was the day it all began to unravel. That was the day when Hitler's decisions, his delusions, his refusal to listen to his generals, cost Germany its last chance to prevent an Allied victory in the West. His insistence that Normandy was a diversion, his refusal to release the panzers, his delay in responding to the invasion, all of these decisions were made in a single day. And they were catastrophic. What did Hitler say when the war turned against him in one day? He said, "So, we're off," with casual confidence. He said, "This is not the real invasion," with absolute certainty. He said the Allies would be thrown back into the sea, even as they established an unbreakable foothold on French soil. He said all of this because he could not accept that he had been wrong. He could not accept that his strategic vision was flawed. He could not accept that Germany was losing the war. And so he retreated into fantasy, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed, planning victories that could never happen, convinced until the very end that his genius would somehow prevail.